Thank you, Georgette, very much, or should I say Deacon. Thank you all for being here. I was really impressed by the positivity of that last presentation, and I've decided that I'm going to speak what's on my heart today, and I'm not in a positive place. Is that okay, or should I give the? I'll give what's on my heart. Now, I did hear that Bobby Schindler said some nice things about me this morning. I just want you all to know that that's because I have him on retainer. And for every compliment, he gets $5. And so he tries to put them in there because, you know, it's a way to boost his retirement plan. So, Bobby, there you are. Thank you very much. I'll have to see what you said. And then if I like it, I'll send you the check. So this morning, when I was getting ready to come here, I made a mistake. I looked in the Washington Post, and I saw a column by George Will in which he came out very forcefully for legalizing assisted suicide and normalizing it in the mores of our society. And I was not surprised by this because George Will abandoned the anti-euthanasia cause years ago. But I was a little surprised by the adamancy of his presentation and by the fact that he's actually doing more than one column to push this. And it is an indication of how far the death agenda has actually come. And so that kind of put me in a bit of a foul mood, which my wife will tell you happens on more than occasions, because I've been doing this since 1993, and I have watched, I hope there's not a correlation between my engaging anti-euthanasia and the spread of euthanasia, but I've watched it spread like a cancer, and I think it's metastasizing. And I thought today that rather than just focus on specific cases, which I used to be able to do and be done within a half hour, 45 minutes, today it would take me 3 hours. I thought I'd try to explain to y'all why I think, see, we're in Virginia, y'all, why I think that this is happening. And some of you may have experienced this. When I started this work, again in 1993, I was able to actually make moral arguments and try to engage in moral persuasion. And then over time, I found that that became almost impossible because if I made a certain moral argument to people who don't agree with me, it was like I was speaking Swahili. We have become a society that, you won't be surprised to hear, has become riven deeper chasms between mutual understandings. And in fact, I went into my files today, and I pulled out an old piece that I wrote in 2015, Culture Debate Not Possible in America. So this is 6 years ago, and it's gotten worse in the 6 years. And what it is, I found a study published in the American Political Science Review. I spend a lot of time, by the way, reading professional journals, because if you want to see what's going to go wrong next in the culture, read the professional journals. They've gone completely over the cliff in terms of common sense, ideology, and so forth. But this was a good article, and the article was, "Is There a Culture War?" by a fellow named William G. Jacoby, and guess what the answer was? Yes, there is. Well, of course there is, because there are contesting worldviews. We no longer share the same worldview as a society in the West. And this is what Jacoby wrote, quote, "The empirical results create a picture of extreme heterogeneity that contradicts any notion of widespread agreement on a set of fundamental principles. The situation does not merely represent differences of degree. Instead, the variability in the value rankings is great enough to represent differences in kind. There are widely distributed, almost diametrically opposing views about which values are important and which not." Now, you certainly find this in the pro-life advocacy around abortion. And you've seen the increasing anger and panic on the part of people who are not pro-life activists, I should say, with regard to the pending Dobbs case and the Texas law and so forth. And when you read what they have to say and the fears that they're expressing, I'm sure some of you are saying, what? How can you think that? Well, the reason they think that is because they don't think the way you think. And this has put us into a place where it's very hard to have a true debate. A debate generally involves agreement on where we want society to go, but differences over means. But we no longer, in many ways, have agreements on how society should go and where it should go. And so all we can do today, at least on the issues that I engage, which has gone far beyond euthanasia, to medical conscience, to radical environmentalism, all things that impact the sanctity and unique value of human life. Animal rights, where animals are, where an elephant, by the way, may become a person according to the New York Supreme Court. There's a case before the New York Supreme Court right now to declare an elephant a non-human person. And if that happens, then animals will begin to have the same kind of rights people have. So these are things that engage me quite a bit. The whole COVID thing has me jumping in. You know, people to be punished if they're not vaccinated by being denied medical treatment. Well, you have to jump in on, I do, jump in on that. So I've come to realize that this is true, and I also think that there's a truth here that we're changing epochs. And we're moving into what I think is an anti-Christian era. And that has an impact on the issues in which you engage and I engage. Because again, that reflects a particular worldview. I mean, until recently, you might have said this might not have been a Christian nation, but it was culturally Christian as a society. But that is shifting now. And a culturally Christian society believes in the unique dignity of human life and the equality of human life. A anti-Christian society no longer takes that as a given. The self-evident truth that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, Jefferson's immortal words, are no longer agreed to by many in this society. And I won't go down the road that I feel like going down in terms of what they're thinking in those terms, but I do want to share one thing with you. There was a time when I used to ask the why now question about euthanasia and assisted suicide. You know, why now? I mean, 150 years ago, if you got bone cancer, you did die in agony because we didn't have the medical abilities to alleviate pain that we now have. We did not have the treatment, the palliative care, the modern hospice movement, the interventions like what we just saw in terms of the sidewalk counseling and crisis pregnancy centers. We didn't have that kind of thing for people who are dying or who have serious illnesses, and now we do. We do have that in the West anyway, in the rich societies. If you got appendicitis, you could die in agony. And yet back then, 150 years ago, you didn't see widespread discussion about, quote, death with dignity and the idea of that euthanasia is the proper approach to serious illness. You didn't see that. Yet today, that's what you see everywhere. And the George Will column that I referenced is just one example. So what happened? And I used to say, why now? Why now? And then I read a little book by a fellow named Yuval Levin. Yuval Levin is a very well expert in moral philosophy. He's a conservative. I think right now he's at the American Enterprise Institute. He's a protege of Leon Kass, the great bioethicist Leon Kass, who headed President Bush's President's Council on Bioethics, who's one of our great thinkers. And Yuval Levin several years ago wrote a little book on when the stem cell fight was raging, which is also part of what we're talking about in terms of human exceptionalism, unique human duty. Do we treat nascent human life as if they're a corn crop? Do we treat them as some kind of fodder for research, or do we treat them as the nascent human beings they are? That is what that issue is about, and that's another whole speech. But Levin said in this this book, Imagining the Future, he answered the why now question for me, and I'd like to read a little bit about what he wrote, and I'll explain. He was talking about Descartes, and he said, Descartes was awfully bold in describing health as without doubt the primary good and the foundation of all other goods of this life. Surely the claim that health is the primary good has consequences well beyond the agenda of the scientists. Any society's understanding of the foundational good necessarily gives shape to its politics, its social institutions, and its sense of moral purpose and direction. How you live has a lot to do with what you strive for. And health is an unusual candidate for the primary good. It is surely an essential good. Without health, not much else can be enjoyed. But Descartes' formulation and the worldview of modern science sees health, this is the key, not only as a foundation, but as a principal goal, not only as a beginning, but also an end. Relief and preservation from disease and pain, from misery and necessity, become the defining ends of human activity and therefore of human society. Close quote. So what Yuval Levin was saying, and he's right, is that the purpose of society has become to eliminate suffering, as opposed to saying promoting righteousness or standing up for the sanctity of human life. What is happening is that the elimination of suffering is becoming paramount in this society. And that, of course, leads to the elimination of the sufferer. And then the concept of suffering becomes very malleable, very elastic. So it isn't just the suffering of the patient, but it can also be the suffering of the family. You know, the family is going through this. How can the family have to put up with the mother-in-law or the grandmother who has dementia? Surely the family should be alleviated of these concerns. Grandma with dementia doesn't have a life worth living. Surely we can do something about that and perhaps give them the lethal jab. And before you say that'll never happen, it's happening in the Netherlands, it's happening in Belgium, and it's soon to happen in Canada. And that matters because Canada's our closest cultural cousin. Right now in those three countries that I just mentioned, if somebody writes an advance directive saying, I have dementia, when I become incompetent, I want to be killed, they will be killed. And there was a case in the Netherlands, and this was a case involving a doctor who had a patient with dementia. The patient with dementia had said, you know, I want to be killed when the time comes, but I want to be the one that decides. And so the woman became incompetent, and the doctor testified that she would repeatedly ask, 3 times at least, ask the patient, is now the time to be euthanized? And the patient would say, oh my gosh, no, that's going a little far, isn't it? And the doctor decided, well, she doesn't know what's good for her. She doesn't know how much suffering her life is causing. So the doctor decided, I'm going to do it even though she hasn't asked for it. And one day she went to the nursing home where this woman was kept with the family, and she drugged the lady's coffee so the lady would fall asleep and she could be dispatched. Well, in the middle of that process starting, the woman woke up and started to fight for her life. She did not want to be killed. The doctor, instead of saying, oh, well, it's clearly not choice, right? Said instead to the family, hold her down. Hold her down. And the family did. And the woman was lethally injected. And the euthanasia people in the Netherlands, the oversight group, said, well, that was absolutely right. There was an outcry internationally. How can that be right, including from me? And so they brought a prosecution. Now, in the Netherlands, when they bring a prosecution about euthanasia, it's not to punish the person they're prosecuting. It's to set a precedent. Because they like to do things above board. What matters in the Netherlands, because they bought this issue of suffering, isn't whether or not something is right or wrong, but whether there's transparency. Because they've lost the concept in this issue of right and wrong. It's completely been wiped out, and that's what euthanasia does to mindsets. It wipes it out. So they brought a prosecution, and guess what? She was found not guilty. of course. And the judge praised her because she had such good intentions, the doctor. And at the time that the doctor did these things, it was against the law to drug patients who were being euthanized, and it was against the law for doctors to decide when the time had come. So Parliament got right in gear, and they changed that law, so now it is okay to drug patients who are incompetent, and it is okay for doctors to decide when the time has come. Because once you accept the concept, the principle, that eliminating suffering is the primary directive, how can you not go there? How can you not go there? Because when you take that prescription, that hemlock, it leads to three world viewpoints. Nihilism, which you see all around us. Hedonism, which you also see all around us. And utilitarianism, which you see all around us and is rife. All three of these are actually rife in the euthanasia issue and all of the life issues. So that's where you end up. And people lose the ability to resist the downward pull of euthanasia because you've now flipped your mindset. And so your logic begins to follow. So there's the issue of suffering for the patient, the issue of suffering for the family. There's also sometimes the issue of suffering for the medical team. How can the medical team be put through this suffering of having to care for somebody in such a degraded state or a state of such limitations or disability? Bobby, he told me, talked about the feudal care issue this morning. That's part of it. And there's also the issue of the suffering of society. Why should we have to pay to take care of these people? You now have a promotion in this country of what's called VSED, Voluntary Stop Eating and Drinking, in the euthanasia movement. It's on the website of Compassion and Choices, which used to be more honestly called the Hemlock Society. And it tells elderly people, if you are tired of life, this is a way to die. And the way it works is you stop eating and drinking, and then you find a doctor willing to palliate your symptoms. Because if you don't have the symptoms palliate, you die in the kind of agony Terry Schiavo did. And they're actually now promoting the idea that, people should be able to write an advance directive and say, when I become incompetent, keep me from food and water. Don't even feed me. Even if I ask for food, don't give me spoon feeding. We're not talking about a feeding tube. Spoon feeding is not medical treatment. So they would force, these documents would actually, if they become legal, force caregivers to starve their wards or their people they're caring for to death. I mean, you're going to have a massive walkout of nurses and so forth, caregivers who aren't going to want to do that. But we're turning people with dementia into the next victims. It started with the terminally ill, ended up also with people like Terry Schiavo with significant cognitive disabilities. We're moving on now into dementia and disability as people who have killable lives. So that's what happens with this idea of eliminating suffering being the prime directive. And so when I say, wait a second, this person has a life of value, the issue is not to kill them, but provide them the kind of care they need so they don't want to be killed. Suicide prevention. When was the last time in a suicide prevention campaign you ever heard any mention of assisted suicide as a problem? I've been tracking it for years. And a lot of the suicide prevention organizations don't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Wouldn't want to be controversial. But when you say some suicides are acceptable, you're pro-suicide. It's like if you don't think so, it's like when you say, well, we don't want you to smoke, but if you smoke, use a filter cigarette. Well, that kills the whole message, doesn't it? So that's why I'm not in a great mood today. I'm sorry. But that's not the only reason I'm not in a great mood. In Germany, of all places, the courts have created a constitutional fundamental right to commit suicide and to have assistance in suicide. Death on demand. Because that is, and I'm cutting stuff short because I don't know how much time I have, but I know you'll get the hook. Who has the time? Am I all right? I'm good. All right. Get the hook and put yourselves out of your misery. How much?
6 minutes.
Oh, gee. 6 minutes. I'm a lawyer. How can I do it in 6 minutes? All right. Germany, the ultimate destination for the euthanasia movement is death on demand. Because I get to decide what my suffering is, and no one can tell me how to die any more than they should be able to tell me how to live my life, and so forth and so on. At Germany's Supreme Court, it's not called that, it's the Constitutional Court. It's the highest court in Germany. And listen to what they wrote in their decision. The right to self-determined death is not limited to situations defined by external causes like serious or incurable illness. Nor does it only apply in certain stages of life or illness. Rather, this right is guaranteed in all stages of a person's existence. Well, if that's true, that has to include children, doesn't it? The individual's decision to end their own life based on how they personally define quality of life and a meaningful existence eludes any evaluation on the basis of general values, religious dogmas, societal norms for dealing with life and death, or consideration of objective rationality. It is thus not incumbent upon the individual to further explain or justify their decision. Rather, their decision must, in principle, be respected by state and society as an act of self-determination. That is an open-ended, absolute right to commit suicide, and then they put in this. The right to take one's life also encompasses the freedom to seek and, if offered, utilize assistance provided by third parties for this purpose. Therefore, the constitutional guarantee of the right to suicide corresponds to equally far-reaching constitutional protection extended to the acts carried out by the persons rendering the assistance. There are no limiting principles whatsoever, except perhaps if somebody is quite literally psychotic because they can't make a rational choice for themselves. Germany got there about 10 years before I thought they would. Not they would, but that the movement would. What has happened in just last year? Austria legalized euthanasia. Most of the states of Australia legalized assisted suicide or euthanasia. New Mexico legalized assisted suicide. We now have, I believe, 9 states and the District of Columbia just over the river with assisted suicide legalization. Oregon, Hawaii, and California have loosened their definitions, their strict guidelines against abuse, because here's what happens. The minute you pass a legalization law and you say, oh, strict guidelines will protect against abuse, as soon as it's legal, they're called obstacles and barriers to the good death. And then that's the launching pad for the next step. The reason this country has been not gone as far as some of the others like Canada, Belgium, and so forth are people like you who are digging in your feet and saying absolutely, or as in the old, excuse me for saying this, but in the old anti-Vietnam chant, hell no, we won't go. And that's having a difference. And that has to continue because I'm often asked, Wesley, can we win? And my answer to that question is that's the wrong question. The question is, can we save lives? And the answer to that is yes. We can make sure no one dies alone. We can make sure that everyone, whether they have cancer or whether they're teenagers who've lost their boyfriend or whether they're a veteran with PTSD, has suicide prevention. We can promote hospice care that takes care of people very well with terminal illnesses. Both my folks died with hospice care. Tremendous people who made their last time on earth valuable. So yes, there is much work to do, and I am enthusiastic. we can save lives. And we can hold up a mirror and say, do you really want to go there? Do you really? And I think when people's attention is finally gotten off of the slogans of death with dignity and the slogans of, oh, there's nothing else that can be done to alleviate suffering, which is a lie. There's always something that can be done to alleviate suffering. People in the crisis pregnancy centers prove it. And if we get to the situation like Germany, then we'll set up the same kind of programs to save people who are thinking of killing themselves. So yes, we can win in the sense that lives can be saved. Whether we can prevent legalization from sweeping the country, I don't know. But I do know they're going to have to get over us if they're going to get to the place where they want. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.